Stranger at the Cova by Michael Kress. Published in serial format. This audiobook of Stranger at the Cova is a work of fiction created by me, Michael Kress, and owned by me. All rights, including copyright, are reserved. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to actual events is purely coincidental. Unauthorized reproduction, distribution, or transmission of this recording in whole or in part is strictly prohibited without prior written consent from the author. Copyright 2024. This book contains mature themes that may not be suitable for all listeners. Discretion is advised. A very brief preface. As a fan of J.R. Tolkien and other Catholic writers, I have long wanted to try to write a full-length novel featuring Catholic themes myself, whether directly or indirectly. This is my first attempt at such a novel. I believe you will find it, as many readers would describe, as clean, that is, missing vulgarities that might make it inappropriate for some readers. However, there are difficult topics in this novel, including marital issues, that might be difficult for some sensitive listeners. Chapter 1. The Arrangement. The night air was stuffy with silence, broken only by the slow, ticking drone of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. John lay still, eyes wide in the darkness, feeling that peculiar anxiety that only arrived at 3 a.m. Some kind of dream had torn him awake, yet it left him only with its residue. A vague disturbance lingering like the stain of mustard wiped hurriedly from a cravat. Mostly gone, but enough to bother. He shifted under the 200 thread count sheets, now somehow damp despite the slight chill. He reached for his phone, knocking it to the ground with a low, nonsensical curse. When he finally retrieved it, the screen lit up, harsh against the dark. He barely glanced at the time before setting it back down. John pushed back the covers and let his bare feet hit the floor, steadying himself as he half rose from the bed. As usual, since the skiing accident 3 years ago, his left foot just grazed the floor, while his right hovered slightly above. It was a constant reminder of their unevenness and the irritating pain of each step. Gritting his teeth, he limped out of the room without his cane, one hand sliding along the banister as he hobbled down the stairs, the varnish smooth beneath his fingers. The house was silent in a way that magnified its size, making it seem grander than it needed to be, as if it were a stand-in for everything he ought to be proud of. Despite the grandfather clock and the other artifacts he'd collected over the years, the house felt hollow. It seemed it could never hold quite enough, that it always needed more crammed into it before he could feel it was enough. More of what, he wondered, running his hand through his thinning hair. More of what? The walls were hung with art he'd chosen meticulously, of course, but it all felt suddenly misplaced, as if arranged by someone he'd only just met. At the bottom of the staircase, he paused, looking over the sitting room. The glow from the street outside cast a neat angle of light across the polished floorboards, throwing up the heavy, familiar shapes of the furniture. Everything looked a little too sharp, a little too defined in the quiet. He stepped toward the fireplace, noting the frames lined up across the mantelpiece, his children's faces preserved behind glass, looking back at him as if from a time that belonged more to them than to him. Daniel, Sophie, and Elliot, all laughing, the clear images were bright, belying the quiet distance that had grown between them. For a moment he reached out to touch one of the frames, his fingers hovering just above the glass. But he pulled his hand back. The last of them, Sophie, had moved out only a year ago. He wondered what time it was for her in California. Then something else caught his eye, a small glint on the side table beside the couch. He'd been on his way to the fridge, but he stopped and moved forward, toward it instead. Squinting in the dim light, he saw it clearly. Rachel's wedding band. He paused, hand brushing his shirt collar, then rubbing the spot at his chest. He recognized the ring instantly, like he'd recognized one of his children. She'd been taking it off more and more, he'd noticed. He never mentioned it, but she always put it back on. Now, here it was, resting on the table, forgotten before she went to bed. He picked it up, feeling the lightness of it in his palm. It seemed to have lost its weight over the years, as if the meaning had drained out of it somehow along the way. Back then it had cost him a fortune. 2 months' salary, he remembered, following the old rule, and just when his first book, The Last Honest Man, had hit the bestsellers list. Rachel had barely been able to speak, her hand to her mouth, choking back tears, only nodding when he asked her to marry him. Funny now that he had thought of it, she'd never actually said yes to the engagement, just that nod. But he'd been happy to have even that. He set the ring back down where he'd found it, his hand lingering just a moment before he turned away. And then, as if conjured by the thought, one domino knocking over an even larger one, a memory Jon had tried to push down but couldn't quite suppress. It was in this very room that Rachel had first mentioned openness. Her voice had been almost rehearsed, light and insistent, like she was suggesting a change in paint color or drapery. She wanted to stretch, she'd said, to have the freedom to explore, to roam. The suggestion, an open marriage, a modern, sophisticated arrangement, had sounded at first like something from a bad novel, something laughable. He couldn't understand her enthusiasm, her drive to fill her life with more things, stranger things and strangers, in a way that felt both intimate and to him deeply wounding. Only it hadn't been a joke. She'd sat there, her ring on the same side table, her expression set, laying it out as a matter-of-fact ultimatum. Accept it, or she filed for divorce. He'd found himself unable to respond. Things hadn't been going well between them back then. Sophie had just moved out. The house had felt oddly stretched, as if compensating for the absence. Both he and Rachel were busy, living separate lives, connecting briefly in the hallway or over a terse text. They weren't yelling or fighting, just on parallel courses. Rachel wanted to live more openly, without a guilty conscience, exploring other people and places, and insisted that it didn't have to threaten what they had. In fact, she'd said, it could strengthen it. They do it all the time in France, she'd added, as if that justification could sit comfortably alongside the enormity of her request. If he wanted her, she'd said, he could have her, but only on her terms. There was a certain fearlessness in her voice, as if she dared him to disagree. She'd even drafted an arrangement for him to review, outlining the details. Take it or leave it, she'd implied. Her attorney was on speed dial. What should he have done? Jon's knuckles whitened around the ring as he remembered the desperation he'd felt in that moment. It had been a year of feeling utterly lost. The children were grown, more or less, but it still felt as if one of them might come downstairs at any moment. How could he let their family fall apart over something he couldn't even fully comprehend? He'd sat quietly then, each protest shrinking to a murmur in his chest. For all his outrage, he hadn't wanted her to leave. 3 days later, he had finally relented, nodded slowly, and said, yes, all right, in a voice that barely sounded like his own. He'd listened as Rachel had gone on about the benefits, the advantages of a new kind of freedom. But for him, there was nothing in it that he wanted to understand. Now he turned the ring over in his palm, feeling its weight once more. In the years since, he'd grown accustomed to Rachel's unannounced absences, her need to seek out some kind of newness, of freshness, as if he were merely one facet of a larger life she was designing for herself. But this ring, this gesture, felt almost like an unsaid apology, or worse, a quiet dismissal. It was a sign left here in plain sight, as if to remind him of the frailty of what they'd built, the hollow center he tried so hard not to see. Jon set the ring back on the side table, his hand lingering for a moment, as if it might offer some reply to the questions filling his mind. He pushed himself away and crossed the room to the kitchen, though he'd already forgotten what he'd come down for. The quiet of the house pressed in around him as he opened the fridge, scanning the neat rows of food and drink, labeled in that detached way, his items marked with a J and hers with an R, each with a date. He shut the door and leaned against the counter, his gaze drifting to the window above the sink, where a dark cloud-strewn sky hung over the streetlights. He felt the stirrings of some resolve, the vague outline of an idea, a thought that, if only he could grasp it, might offer some clue about what to do to fix his life. And what had it all brought him, in the end, exactly? A marriage in name only? The pretense of stability? The illusion of keeping the family together? Did his kids even know? He traded pieces of himself, small concessions at first, until they'd piled up and filled the spaces between them, leaving him like a stranger in his own life and profoundly lonely in his marriage. The irony wasn't lost on him. The Last Honest Man, he'd called that his first book, a title that now felt like a mockery more than a mark of his success. It was still sold all these years later, as if signifying that he was still here, still breathing. He pushed himself off the counter, moving through the house, as if he might find something solid to anchor him, something to ease the scattered weight of his thoughts. The art on the walls, each piece carefully chosen, was meant to reflect a sense of culture, of taste. But tonight it all looked off, as if someone else had decorated his home. There was a painting of a stormy sea, part of a lot of 3 he'd bought on a whim and never paid much attention to. He noticed now for the first time that a small figure appeared to be standing in the water beside a boat. It didn't mean anything to him, but it struck him as strange. Maybe it was like him standing there while the storm raged on and no one knew. He couldn't even remember what other paintings had come along with it. As he moved past the entryway, he caught sight of himself in the hallway mirror. There he was, hair graying at the edges, lines etched deep around his eyes, his mouth, a stranger almost. He stared at his reflection, searching for some trace of the man he'd once thought he'd become. But there was only silence, a stillness that felt like it might swallow him whole if he stood there too long. Jon sighed and let the image go, moving back through the sitting room toward the stairs. He glanced again at the side table, at the ring he'd set down so carefully. It lay there in the same place, a small perfect circle, glinting in the low light. With a last look at the room, the framed photographs, the polished furniture, the art he no longer recognized, Jon began his climb back upstairs. The limp slowed his steps, like a persistent sore in one's mouth that didn't stop you from eating, but robbed you of any joy from it. Specialists had advised against further surgery, and he had tried anyway, and that too had failed. So he had learned to live with the ache. Back in the bedroom, he saw Rachel on her side in the bed. Her dark hair now dyed even blacker than it had been when she was a chocolate brunette. She hadn't noticed his getting up. He sank back onto the edge of the bed, staring down at his hands. They were trembling slightly. He didn't remember them ever doing that before. I hope it's not Parkinson's, he thought. The emptiness he felt seemed to expand, pressing against him from every angle. He leaned back, his head sinking into the pillow, eyes fixed on the ceiling. And as he lay there waiting for sleep, he wondered when he'd last felt certain about anything at all, or what the whole point of all this was. But he couldn't decide what this was exactly. Life, money, moderate fame. Rachel laughed softly in her sleep. He was drifting somewhere between waking and sleep when the faint vrr of his phone vibrated against the nightstand. Jon reached over, squinting against the screen's glow. The message was from his son Daniel. Sorry to text so late, Dad, but Julie just packed her things and the kids and drove to her mother's. She said she needs space, whatever that means. Jon felt a pang he couldn't quite name. He knew marriage pain. Was this worse than an arrangement? He could picture Daniel in his small living room pacing, or maybe sitting with his hand covering his head, trying to make sense of things in the way Jon himself had done more times than he cared to remember. The image of his own hidden apartment flickered in his mind, a sanctuary he'd stumbled upon, an abandoned place no one else knew about, where he'd escaped during the harder moments of the past year. Maybe I need to get away and go back there today, he thought absently. Then refocused on his son. Jon typed back, I'm sorry, son, are you all right? A reply came almost immediately. No, but it's fine. Sorry for bothering you. You're not bothering me, Daniel. Do you want to talk? There was a long pause on the screen, staying blank as Jon waited, almost certain Daniel would call, but then the screen lit up with a simple response, not right now. He sighed, sinking back into the pillow, phone still in hand. Daniel had always been the dutiful one, the son who'd tried to do everything by the book, just as Jon had once tried himself, back when he believed that hard work and a bit of luck could hold a life together. Jon had known Daniel and Julie were struggling, but what could he offer his son? He didn't feel like any kind of authority on marriage. Not anymore. He thought of Julie with her quiet but resolute demeanor, the way she could change a room just by standing in it, often with a baby on her hip. He liked Julie, a capable and talkative young woman who always seemed to have something brewing beneath the surface. She'd held the family together through Daniel's long hours, during his relentless 20s when he'd been grinding away at his career. And now she had driven to her mother's. Erupted, he thought, and he didn't exactly blame her. She had the house, the kids, the chaos, while Daniel had work to lose himself in. Maybe she didn't need space. Maybe she needed Daniel. Maybe she didn't know how to fill that role as well as she needed. Setting the phone down, Jon's thoughts drifted to Sophie and Elliot. Sophie had left for California a year ago, chasing some elusive sense of purpose she could never fully explain. A vague path wrapped in New Age spirituality and yoga retreats, always searching for something, though she wasn't quite sure what. She called occasionally, her voice filled with practiced optimism, but he could hear the doubt lurking beneath it. And Elliot, on the other hand, the middle child, was adrift, flitting between jobs and cities and relationships, as if life were something he could dip in and out of at will. He'd cycled through 6 universities in as many years, yet hadn't earned a single degree. The last Jon had heard, Elliot had moved in with a girlfriend in Munich, though he doubted it would last more than a few months. His children, his marriage, each of them slipping as if the whole structure he'd built was crumbling, revealing nothing solid beneath. He'd wanted so much for them, had done everything he thought would give them stability, opportunity, and success. But here he was, lying alone, though Rachel slept beside him. How strange. That was life in the modern world, he thought. Alone together. Opening the notes app on his phone, he typed it out. Alone together. He was a writer, after all, even in the midst of this bleakness.